Welcome once again to our series of lectures on the foundations of Western civilization. This lecture, number 29, begins a series of 3 in which we'll explore the heirs of the Roman Empire. The Roman world produced 3 heirs: the Islamic world, to which we will turn in this lecture, the Byzantine Empire, to which we'll turn in the next one, and the Germanic West, to which we'll turn in the lecture after that. It's important to bear in mind that, as we were stressing in our lectures on late antiquity, the Roman Empire transformed. It changed gradually over a long period of time, and it changed slowly. It's also important to emphasize that the Roman Empire did not simply vanish, but it left heirs. It bequeathed much of its political structure, its social structure, its economic structure, its intellectual structure to each of its heirs, but each of these inheritances was taken up in a slightly different way. Now, from the sorts of things that we talked about when we were considering late antiquity, you might well have predicted that the Eastern Roman Empire was going to have some kind of a future. We'll explore in our next lecture just what kind of future that might be, but one might very well have predicted that future. And of course, we also saw that the western half of the Roman Empire, even though the Roman imperial administration itself vanished, had gradually, slowly but surely, transformed itself from provinces of an empire into kingdoms under Germanic kings. So you might very well have supposed that those kingdoms were going to have some kind of a future. What you would not have predicted, what no one could have predicted, would have been the emergence of the Arab peoples, of the Prophet Muhammad, and of the Islamic faith. And that's our subject in this lecture, the first then of our 3 on the heirs of the Roman Empire. Now, in order to think a little bit about the Islamic world, a subject that has obviously come to be of enormous significance to us in recent times, we want to begin with just a basic consideration of the Arabian Peninsula, of the Arab peoples, before the coming of the Prophet Muhammad. We'll talk a little about the Prophet Muhammad himself, and then we'll turn to some key elements of the faith which he taught, and then we'll talk a little bit about the emergence of Islamic political institutions. The Caliphate is what we'll be talking about towards the end of this lecture. Now, the Arabian Peninsula was a large, turbulent, contested region. It was contested internally among large numbers of sort of loosely affiliated tribes. Now, tribes, clans, if you will, in the Arabian Peninsula were very much like those Germanic tribes that we talked about in an earlier lecture. That is to say, they were communities of people related by blood, yes, but also clients, adherents, hangers-on, allies, friends, very, very complex social organizations. But the key point that I wish you to retain is that the Arabian Peninsula had no single, overall, unifying political structures. In addition to that, the Arabian Peninsula was, at least portions of it, for a long time contested territory among 2 other outside powers. The first of these, the Eastern Roman Empire. The second of these, the Persian Empire. Now, the Persian Empire, which we talked about many lectures ago, and to which we've referred once or twice since then, was of course still there, still prominent, and still fairly significant. In addition, the Arabian Peninsula had for a long time been open to the religious influences of Judaism and Christianity. Now, the traditional Arab faiths were quite different, and we'll turn to them in a few minutes, but the point is that the Arabian Peninsula had been subject to outside influences. Now, the whole land had never really been conquered fully by anyone. The Roman Empire had never fully conquered the Arabian Peninsula, not really much more than the northernmost portions of it, though exerted influence certainly further to the south. The Persians had never conquered the Arabian Peninsula. Alexander the Great had not conquered the Arabian Peninsula. So we have, in a way, to think both about external influences flowing in and then autonomous developments inside the Arabian Peninsula that sort of went flowing along over long, long periods of time, influenced, yes, by outside forces, but never fundamentally changed by them, never fundamentally taken over. We talk, for instance, in the Mediterranean world about processes of Romanization, but it would be very difficult to talk about the Romanization of the Arabian Peninsula or of the peoples who lived there. Now, A key moment in the life of the Arabian Peninsula, in the history of this great region, came with the life and the career of the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad was born in about 570, and he died in 632. So that will locate him in time for us. You'll see that he falls at the very end of that period that we were calling in our last lectures late antiquity, and then perhaps exerts influences far beyond that, hence our notion of heirs of the Roman world. Now, Muhammad came from an old and wealthy and very well-connected Meccan family. He himself seems to have come from a relatively minor branch of this family, perhaps not from one of the wealthier parts of the family, but the large tribe, the Quraysh they're called, were nevertheless very, very significant. As a young man, Muhammad had entered the caravan trade. That was a typical career for a sort of bright and upcoming young Arab of good family, someone with reasonable ambitions, someone with fairly good opportunities. He earned fairly quickly a reputation for probity. He was apparently very wise, very responsible, very reliable sort of person. And probably as a result of that, he married a woman by the name of Kadya, who came also of a fairly prominent family and who was somewhat older than he. So obviously in some ways an arranged marriage, though it appears that theirs was a companionate marriage and a very happy one over quite a number of years. Muhammad was also a young man of exquisite spiritual sensibilities. From the time he was a young man, he began to retire to the hills and to the caves outside of the city of Mecca, and there he began to receive visitations from the angel Gabriel, who taught him about Allah, about God. On the basis of these revelations, Muhammad soon began preaching a new, monotheist, ethical, exclusive faith. We'll have a lot more to say in a few minutes about the contents of his teaching, about the contents of that faith. But he began to teach this new faith, first of all in Mecca, and not surprisingly, first of all among his family members, among those most closely associated with him. And he immediately began to encounter trouble. Now, he began to encounter trouble on several different fronts. His teachings were quite contrary, for example, to the traditional religions of the Arabian Peninsula. In the Arabian Peninsula, there were not only sort of vast political and social divisions, but religious divisions as well. The various Arab peoples followed a whole series of old, traditional, polytheist cults. They came together, in a way, these cults did, only in sort of acknowledging jointly a shrine at Mecca, a shrine called the Kaaba. It's a black meteorite stone that is enshrined inside a rather elaborate architectural structure, then in the center of the city, now inside the great mosque in Mecca, the great worship place for the Arabs in that city. Now, people from all over the Arabian Peninsula had long made pilgrimages to Mecca to come and visit the Kaaba. So, Muhammad's teachings, on the one hand, were quite different from, and perhaps threatening to, traditional Arab religion. On the other hand, Muhammad's teachings raised in the minds of the Meccan elite, at any rate, the specter of competition for their great cult center in the middle of the city, the Kaaba, and the possibility that if people were to embrace Muhammad's teachings, they would no longer come to Mecca, they would no longer come to the Kaaba. It would be cynical to say that they were utterly unconcerned about religious issues, but it would certainly be true to say that they thought that in certain respects Muhammad was bad for business. Now, facing grave problems in Mecca, gradually it was made very clear to him that he and his new teachings weren't welcome. Muhammad and a few of his followers departed for the city of Medina, not too far away actually in the Arabian Peninsula. He left Mecca for Medina in the year 622. Now, in the world that comes after Muhammad, in the Islamic world, this is remembered as the Hijrah, as the pilgrimage or the flight of the Prophet from Mecca to Medina. And it actually begins a new era. Indeed, in the Islamic world, dating is from the year of the Hijrah, from 622 until the present. Now, you may, from time to time in news reports or somewhere else, have noticed that the number of the year in the Arab world is different from the number of the year in most of the rest of the world. That's because we count, typically in the West now, from the birth of Christ. They count from the Hijrah. It's also important that in the West, a solar calendar is used, in the East, a lunar calendar. So the year of the Hijra keeps falling, in a sense, a little bit behind the Anno Domini date, the year of the Lord date in the West. So you can't, in other words, just take 2002, let us say, and subtract 622 and get the year in the Islamic world. But the point I'm really trying to make is not all of that trivia about calendars, but rather to say that this event, the Hijra, was remembered as a decisive moment in the history of Muhammad himself and then of the faith which he taught. Now, it's important to say, too, he had been invited to come to Medina by leading citizens of that city, perhaps because they were rivals of Mecca, perhaps because they thought that a great religious teacher like Muhammad might help them to compose some pretty severe problems, some pretty severe rivalries inside their own city itself. There were indeed intense religious and social conflicts in Medina, and it was hoped, you see, that Muhammad might be able to come and bring some measure of peace and order and stability to that troubled city. What then are these teachings? What is it exactly that Muhammad was teaching? Well, we may say, first of all, that we know about his teachings from three sources. From the Quran, which are the scriptures of Islam, we'll come to them in a bit. From the Hadith are the sayings of the Prophet, things that Muhammad himself said. He was thought to be a very holy man. He was thought to be a very good man. And so his followers collected his sayings. And these were collected in a body of material known as the Hadith. And these were also then not held on the same plane as the Quran among followers of Muhammad and Muhammad's teachings, but nevertheless thought to be very significant. And we have collections of these hadiths. So for us as historians, they are another valuable source. Now, we may just briefly say that although all of the hadith are attributed to Muhammad himself, these are his sayings, these are his wise teachings, we know that the collections of hadith continued to evolve from the early 7th century well into the 9th. And then the collections were more or less frozen. So it's a little difficult for us to say, as historians, concretely, how much of this material actually goes right back to Muhammad himself. Certainly a good deal of it does, but we can't say confidently it all does. Finally, the Sunnah. Now, the Sunnah is the good practice. That's what that means. And basically, it was Muhammad's practice. In other words, how he lived his life, his basic customs, his basic habits, his basic routines, and so on, were also noted by his contemporaries, were taken down, and also then regarded as important, not as binding, but as important for members of the Islamic community. So, looking back then as historians, we have Quran, Hadith, and Sunnah. Among these, in the Islamic world, and then for those of us who would wish to understand that world, incomparably the most significant is the Quran. Now, the first important thing to remember about the Quran is that it is a body of recitations. That is to say, Muhammad was commanded by the angel to recite the Word of God. The Word of God was given him, the Word of Allah was given him by the angel, and he gave it on to his followers. So, the point quite simply is that Muhammad is not the author of the Quran. Muhammad is not a person who sat down and wrote a book about his ideas about religion. The Quran is understood to be the very Word of God himself. Now, in that sense, of course, it bears comparison with the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament as the Christians call it, and with the Christian Scriptures, the New Testament as Christians call it. Now, with most of the books of the Hebrew Scriptures, and again with the books of the New Testament, the Christian Scriptures, although there are controversies here and there about exact identities of authors, we can name the authors of the various books, the great prophetic books, Isaiah, let us say, or the Gospel of John or of Matthew, let us say. But in the Quran, you see, what we have is simply God's Word handed to us as it were straight. Muhammad merely transmits it to us. All right, so very important then not to regard the Quran as a book Muhammad wrote, but as the revelation of God which he handed on. All right. Now, as I stressed a moment ago, the Hadith are collections of Muhammad's own sayings outside the Quran, things that Muhammad said, sometimes indeed about the Quran, sometimes offering his views, his interpretations, and sometimes just other comments that he had about social or religious or political or other conditions. And then finally, just to repeat once more, the Sunnah the good practice, the fundamental customs of Muhammad himself. And of course, the Sunnah then becomes the identifying mark of Sunni Muslims. To this day, the largest number of Muslims in the world, those who hold themselves to follow strictly the good practice of the Prophet himself. Now, if we take these materials together, they add up to a faith, they add up to a religion with a few very basic requirements. A few very basic requirements. The first of these, people had to make al-Islam, the surrender to Allah. One must surrender oneself completely to Allah. A person who has made al-Islam is Muslim, or as we say, is a Muslim. Therefore, Muslims are people who have made al-Islam, who have surrendered to Allah. So there is the first central sort of religious doctrine. Now, to capture the essential requirements then of the Islamic faith, the surrendered faith, the faith of surrender, the faith of an individual surrender to Allah, we usually speak in terms of 5 pillars, 5 sort of fundamental things that a Muslim, someone who has made al-Islam, must do. These are, in the first place, a profession of faith. Here is the creedal statement of Islam. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. If you say that 3 times with a pure heart facing Mecca, you have made al-Islam. You are Muslim. Now, we saw, for example, when we were talking about Christianity, that there was, in late antiquity, a very considerable battle over identifying a creed, a basic statement of faith. And the Nicene Creed, for example, of the Christian churches is a very long document. But in Islam, it's very brief. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. This is fundamentally what one must believe. The other elements of the 5 pillars have to do with practice. Now, this is interesting, too, because you recall perhaps when we talked about the 10 Commandments, we noticed that the first group bear on the relationship between a believer, a Hebrew, and God, and the second group bear on relationships among the Hebrews. So there is obviously a parallel here with Muhammad, with the 5 pillars of Islam. So, the second pillar, fasting. Especially during the month of Ramadan, one 30-day period every year when there must be fasting from sun up until sundown. The idea of asceticism, the idea of emptying oneself, the idea of practicing sort of rigorous personal and thus religious discipline. Now, we saw in Christianity there were, in a certain sense, professional ascetics. We talked about monks. For Muslims, everyone must practice an element of asceticism during 1 month in every year. In the second place, prayer. 5 times daily, facing Mecca. Facing Mecca, one will sometimes see devout Muslims anywhere in the world on a number of occasions during the course of the day, lay down a prayer rug, orient themselves towards Mecca, and pray. And if at all possible, these prayers on a Friday should be carried on in a mosque, a Muslim house of prayer. In the fourth place, among these pillars of Islam, alms. Generous almsgiving. Now, here we have an element of Muhammad building a responsibility for the community into his faith as well. The idea, then, that those with much should give something on behalf of those who have little. Finally, there was the idea that once in one's lifetime, if at all possible, one should make a pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, in connection with this pilgrimage, it's interesting to ask whether this might have been, on Muhammad's part, a concession to those Meccan elites who had been in the first place very much worried about the impact on the city of Mecca of his new religious teachings. Well, obviously, he is maintaining here the old traditional pilgrimage to Mecca as a key element of his new faith. So, 5 pillars. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet as a statement of faith. 5 pillars, then, as a way of maintaining that faith in practice. What we have, then, is a faith of orthopraxy more than of orthodoxy. Now, those are 2 big fancy words that fundamentally mean that in the Islamic world, great stress was laid on what you did, how you behaved, on your conduct, more than on your intellectual assent to an elaborate set of doctrinal teachings. Indeed, for a long time, there really were no professional theologians in the Islamic world. For a long time, there was nothing like the Church Fathers. There were no popes in the Islamic world. There were no bishops in the Islamic world. There was not a clergy as there was in the Christian tradition, or, for that matter, when we think of the learned rabbis and of the temple priests among the Jews, even among Judaism. There's another critical element to the Islamic faith as it was taught by Muhammad and picked up by his successors, and this is the notion of the Ummah Muslima, the community of all those who had made al-Islam. Now, what's interesting about this idea, well, many things are, but fundamentally what's interesting here is that this is a community which transcends national borders, political borders, social borders, ethnic borders, indeed all borders. So that even today we will occasionally hear hints of this when Islamic leaders in one part of the world speak as if all Muslims on the planet are to rise up as one in answer to their call. Well, as in the dawning 21st century, the likelihood of such a call being answered all over the world, I think, is small. But the notion is there, and the notion is there from the very beginning. Well, at the very end of his life, Muhammad was able finally to return, actually not without some violence and bloodshed, but he was able to return to the city of Mecca and sort of in triumph. He then returned to Medina and died there. What would happen next? How is there to be a successor to Muhammad? He has been the prophet of God, and indeed in the Islamic tradition, the last prophet. The first prophet had been the patriarch Abraham. Jesus had been a prophet. To Muslims, Christians made this mistake. They assigned partners to Allah. They imagined Jesus to be divine. Jesus in the Islamic tradition is a prophet, a holy and revered prophet, but a prophet just the same. And Muhammad is the last prophet. Well, on Muhammad's death, an old associate by the name of Abu Bakr became caliph, successor to the prophet. Now, in the first place, presumably, this would have implied only successor to the prophet's political, social, military leadership. In other words, no one could exactly succeed to his religious role. Over time, the caliphs would gradually begin to assume responsibility for sort of the custodianship of the faith, and then perhaps gradually begin to have some religious significance ascribed to them. But initially and in theory, they succeed only to the temporal dimensions, not to the spiritual dimensions of the prophet's rules. Now, when Muhammad died, a number of these tribes, clans, groups, call them what you will, in the Arabian Peninsula fell away. They felt they'd made a bargain with Muhammad and they were not about to carry this bargain on with anybody else. Abu Bakr therefore fought a series of lightning campaigns against the apostates, those who fell away, as they were called by the Muslims, and they were eventually sort of brought back between 632 and 634. Abu Bakr and his successors then launched a series of lightning campaigns, which in just over a century, now compare this to the Roman Empire, which expanded for some 5 centuries. The Islamic Caliphate, as a political entity, was built in just about 1 century. Muslim armies went right across North Africa, crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, into Spain, and into central Gaul. Muslim armies went to the frontiers of India and China. Tremendous expansion. Now, we can identify, I think, some reasons for this dynamic and remarkable success. Some of it probably eludes us, but we can, I think, identify at least a few basic reasons for this success. Just before the Islamic armies launched these campaigns, Constantinople and Persia had worn themselves out in a long, brutal series of wars. There was an opportunity. There were deep religious divisions among Eastern Christians. Going back, of course, as we have seen, to the patristic era, there were large numbers of Christian communities who, in those Trinitarian and Christological controversies that we talked about in earlier lectures, had come down on one or the other side of these issues. The Islamic armies, in other words, did not attack a world that was unified against them. Raiding and plundering had been a way of life in Arabia for centuries. Then Islam prohibited Muslims from raiding each other. So now they began to raid others. And finally, the Prophet himself had taught the need to expand the faith. He taught the need for jihad, holy war. Now this is a term about which there has been a great deal of confusion. In traditional Islamic teaching, the world is divided into two. How many people divide the world into two? The world is divided into two. There is the Dar al-Islam, the house of surrender, and the Dar al-Harb, the house of war. Now initially, and this is of course similar in many ways to the Christian experience, the war is to be inside the heart of the individual believer. It is here that one must conquer. It is not originally the case that the war is to be carried to the infidel, to the person who will not convert. And in early times, at any rate, Christians and Jews were understood to be peoples of the book. And as peoples of the book, they had to pay taxes, they had to pay tribute, but they were otherwise given a privileged status inside the caliphate. In other words, they were not forced to convert. So the infidels were non-Christians and non-Jews. Now in 661, the original line of successors to Muhammad, the original line of caliphs, died out, and there emerged a new family of caliphs, the Umayyad. These were soldiers from Syria who happened to have in their possession the best armies in the Islamic world, and they settled down to building the basic political institutions of the caliphate, creating a governing structure which in some ways mirrored the governing structures of the Roman Empire, creating sort of quasi-bureaucratic organizations, creating very elaborate tax collecting mechanisms, and so on. They also moved the capital to Damascus, closer to the more militarily threatened frontiers. Now the Umayyads ruled for about a century, just a little less than a century, and eventually large numbers of people who particularly lived along the frontiers and who were not the old Meccan elites from the early days, Muhammad's followers, sort of felt that they had not been getting a fair share of opportunities in this expanding caliphate, and as a result there was a palace revolution in 750 that brought a new family to power, the Abbasids. These were, as I've said, ordinary soldiers who came from provincial regions. They were very pious, very devout Muslims, and they moved the capital to yet a new city. Indeed, they built a brand new city where none had existed before. That city was Baghdad. This was a period of brilliant cultural achievements. The early Abbasid period, the first century and a quarter of Abbasid rule, it was well into the 9th century, was a time when the caliphs again endowed a great house of study, a great sort of, well, one might think of this as a little like the museum at Alexandria in ancient times. They built a house of study, and scholars came together and began to tackle the massive corpus of Greek learning, but especially its philosophical and scientific works. An interesting question, and one to which there isn't an easy answer, is why was it that in the Islamic world it was particularly the philosophical and scientific dimension of the Greek heritage that attracted interest, that attracted scholarship, that attracted study, whereas in the West, other aspects of the philosophical and then the literary heritage of ancient Greece is what attracted interest and reflection and study, thus putting East and West on two slightly divergent paths. We'll bring those paths together a few lectures down the way here in our series. Eventually, the caliphate began breaking up. Spain fell away, for example, in 750. Egypt and much of North Africa fell away by the 9th century. The once mighty Arab army had in a way gone soft. It was increasingly made up of sort of uncontrollable Turkish mercenaries, people from way along and beyond the frontiers of the Islamic world. And these people were really unable to be controlled effectively by the caliphs, and consequently the military leaders of the Islamic army began really to have more power than the caliphs themselves. The Abbasids ruled nominally until 1258. But after about the year 900, the Islamic world had created a large series of small entities united by a single faith. We have a new universal faith, a faith that is taught to be for all people. We have a new chosen people, the Arabs. We have a new holy book, the Quran. But again, we have a people of faith and a religious experience deeply rooted in the cultures, in the traditions, in the ideals of classical antiquity. Thus far, then, the first of the heirs of the Roman Empire, and as I suggested, the least predictable of the three. We'll turn in our next lecture to the Byzantine Empire, to the evolving Eastern Roman Empire.